My new best friend in the whole world, Kenneth Davis, Big Ten country, with us now. And Kenneth, last week we talked about what Michigan does if Bryce Underwood says no. And I thought since Garrett is here and we want to get this therapeutically out in the open as an LSU fan, we want to do that quickly. Let's lead off with Bryce Underwood and now likely Derek Meadows, the wide receiver that they've been kind of tied at the hip together, going to Michigan. Dave Portnoy and whoever else he had involved in this.
John Ross.
Stephen Ross. Is it Stephen Ross?
Stephen Ross, owner of the Dolphins.
Owner of the Dolphins. Dave Portnoy got Bryce Underwood there. We were born at the wrong time, Kenneth. Not that anybody would have given NIL to a 5'7" nose guard / offensive lineman. You know, plug and play offensive lineman. I could do all 5 positions, just not well, but plug and play. I knew them all. Nobody was giving me NIL. But what do you think about this for Michigan, who now, they needed this badly because they're going to lose a lot of their guys from this national championship team that left over, like Will Johnson and some of those offensive linemen. But it's been an abysmal season because of one thing, the quarterback. One thing. And now I don't know if Bryce Underwood fixes that right away, but he's there and they can go get a rental out of the portal. And it looks like Sherrone Moore might have shaken off the post-national championship, departures and hangover that they had.
Shout out one to Michigan, man, and owners going out and do what they have to do to get that money up to bring in a young man like that. I thought, and this is for Garrett, the coffers at LSU was going to take care of this big business. I'll say this, even with the offensive lineman leaving and looking at Sherrone Moore and what he's done in the trenches as being an elite recruiter, there may be a situation where you may have some offensive linemen who need experience, but the quality and pedigree I'm not afraid of as far as dropping off at Michigan. As you just mentioned, Paul, perhaps it'd be best to get a rental to let him sit for a season. I will be interested in how that's talked about, if it's more of a Dylan Raiola situation. I haven't heard anything about that, if this young man is pressed to get out there right away. And the weird thing would be, if you look at it where next year is still a year of building, you may look at it as a year to may not initially, but to get him out there so he can get some reps. I think this is huge for Sherrone Moore and for Michigan, stamping a flag and putting it out there that we're still hungry, and this isn't going to be an anomaly as far as Michigan being a national contender. This is a return to prominence, and perhaps it's even more prominent than what we've talked about from Charles Woodson's days there in the 90s, where, it was the AP and the coaches poll didn't necessarily agree on who the national champion was. I think this is huge, getting the number 1 recruit in the country. Michigan hasn't had a recruit on the offensive side with this type of pedigree and this type of ranking. It speaks a lot about this institution. Also, I just don't think you could have let a young man from your state leave the state when you just won a national championship. The excuses were weak, really, when you're talking about where Michigan has been the last several seasons and being able to punch it through last year to let Bryce Underwood leave. You've harped on it all season long that they needed a transfer portal quarterback, and that still doesn't solve next season. But when you look at what you can tell recruits now coming in, when you look at the fact that Michigan already, because it's Michigan, is going to be on national television, but now you got one of the top recruits in the country, it adds more cachet. It helps and it boosts recruiting, and it also lets people know that the coffers are open and the money is being spent in the University. The University of Michigan is primarily here to stay as one of the perennial powerhouses within the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think Ohio State should just float out there that now they're going to have a $27 million roster to see if Michigan will go to 28.
Right.
Whether or not that's true, just to see them spend like crazy. To me, I like the subterfuge of it. But this is huge for Michigan. It also, and you're a big SEC fan too, Kenneth. For Brian Kelly, this is absolutely devastating news. You're at 6-4 now. You've lost a bunch of games in a row. The message boards are going crazy. LSU, because of the kind of chaotic governmental structure in Louisiana, is constantly in the red for the university. And so they have these problems because of, 100 years of Louisiana political corruption that affect them. Not that Michigan probably doesn't have similar. I mean, everybody probably has them.
I live in Illinois.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Illinois is like Chicago is what we call Northern Baton Rouge when it comes to same thing. Like I have a feeling like they were just like read history books. Like, ooh, that's a good idea. We should do that too.
Ooh, that one. Did you see what they did there?
Highlight that. Let's do that in the meeting. That was a good idea. That was a good one. But for LSU, this is really devastating, isn't it?
I mean, I think the worst part is this. We go from, and we've talked about it here at the beginning of the season, thinking that they were going to beat SC, thinking that SC was better. Then LSU proving that was, at that point, an anomaly, and that they were a really good team, and that you had this heralded recruit coming in. So even though this season wasn't necessarily what you expected, you looked at it as a stepping stone to this situation. And I don't know, and bringing in Brian Kelly and being up here by the University of Notre Dame, you knew there were limitations going there, but you didn't know, and you mentioned some of the limitations at LSU. Was he still going to be able to exploit being at a SEC powerhouse? And it also, the flip side, LSU is one of those schools where the talent is always there, but I don't know if they can necessarily have the right mix in the room. Like it's something where you look at the squad and you'll be like, man, it makes sense. They should be a national contender, but there's always losses that you don't expect. And there's just always something. And usually sometimes it's a quarterback a lot. And we talked about that here at LSU last week until the last couple of years when you look at Malik Neighbors and you look at, not Malik Neighbors, you look at Jaden Daniels and you look at Joe Burrow. Usually it's kind of been at quarterback. And I told you last week about how I had an affinity for past LSU quarterbacks. I think it's terrible for Brian Kelly, but also it's one of those things like this, and let's just be real, it's kind of LSU too. And I know Garrett's there, and you don't want to hear that. But I used to say the same about Michigan fans when they wanted to kick Jim Harbaugh out. Who are you going to really get this better than him? Sometimes you expect more than necessarily what you may be able to bring in, and you outkick your coverage. I don't know if Brian Kelly can bring a national championship to LSU. I wouldn't toss the baby out with the bathwater just yet. Me personally, I would probably give him a couple of more years to really get his kids through there before you decide to move on from him. And also look at this when you're talking about Bryce Underwood. This was a situation that Michigan had to do what they were supposed to do. Like this was more important for Michigan than this was for LSU. All right. Like this would have been the flip. This would have been the flip of a kid in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge or some parish, deciding to go to Michigan while he's in the state of Louisiana, and LSU losing out on him. So I don't want to just heap this totally on him and be like, see, you're a fool. And you mentioned this comes to boosters too. This is about money. Like having an offensive play calling mind like Brian Kelly and the talent is one of the reasons that he was going to go there, and still going to be one of the reasons why you'll be able to bring in receivers like you had last year. We know it's a cornerback U school, but still the money had to add up. And that's what we were talking about last week. Michigan had to ante up to make sure that this young man didn't leave, and they did what they were supposed to do. So I don't want to just, even though you can hit Brian Kelly upside the head with what the hell is going on, I don't want to lambast him with this, because I think this was more of a Michigan prove it thing than a straight Brian Kelly, you're messing up type of thing.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think they got to give him time to figure out, and they've got to get time to raise some NIL funds to compete with this for sure. But he's got to do some soul searching in the offseason, because they're like the most upside down team in the country. Like when the offense plays well, the defense doesn't. And right now, after that A&M game, they've been exposed, and neither have done either at the same time. So the biggest game in the Big Ten this week is Indiana versus Ohio State. We're going to end talking about Nebraska and Wisconsin, because it's kind of fascinating to me going on with those two schools trying to keep their head above water right now. But this is a no-lose situation for Ohio State, because if they lose the game, their losses are going to be to likely what would be the number 1 and number 2 team in the country, because Indiana would jump up to that spot, in a win over probably the number 4 to 6 team in the country based on how Penn State gets ranked. So they would have a great quality win and 2 quality losses, which if Indiana wins, I doubt it's a blowout. I mean, I just think it's probably a close game. If Ohio State wins this game, Indiana could now be put behind the 8 ball, especially if Army beats Notre Dame. You're going to have like a lot of this moving around. But Ohio State, their season isn't over if they lose. Now, if they lose to Michigan next week, 2 in a row, their season's over. And Ryan Day starts, just putting Pepto in his coffee. But what do you think about this game? Ohio State right now, double-digit favorites at home. Mm-hmm. But Indiana's a team I don't like just flat out saying they don't have a chance in this. Curt Cignetti's got them. They've got moxie.
Yeah. Listen, I think we've talked about this from weeks back, that this is the loss that I see on Indiana's schedule. And look, Curt Cignetti's done everything that he needs to do. I think when you think about like the Nebraska game, he was able to take advantage of mismatches, and you really don't have that versus this Ohio State team. And I think that this is just a thing where talent is going to catch up with you. And we've talked about ad nauseum the struggles of Will Howard, but we've seen how they've used him in the running game. Now that's a catch-22, because when he's out on the run, his accuracy is decreased, and we all know he doesn't have necessarily the strongest arm. Indiana has the benefit of Mikhail Kamara on the edge rush, and edge rushes have been a nightmare for Will Howard this season. But in saying that, I think Indiana will keep the game within the spread, but I definitely don't think Indiana's beaten Ohio State. And look back to the Michigan game, where when we talked about like Big Ten football, and you mentioned, for instance, the offensive lineman that will be leaving Michigan this year, when we're talking about the trench warfare, and yeah, Ohio State may have some injuries on the offensive line, but the depth, and then the defensive line, and what we've seen that defensive line and the young men that return this year, I think is going to be too much for the Hoosiers and Curt Cignetti. But I do think they will have a really good turnout. I just hope they don't get knocked out the CFP because of this, because this type of season, they deserve to be in the college football playoffs. Unfortunately, Penn State is in there running amok. To be honest with you. But yeah, I have Ohio State winning. I think it could be by double digits, but not to the spread. So I think they can get 11, but I don't see them getting 13 and a half or whatever the spread is right now, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really don't know how the game's going to go, but I like Curtis Rourke. I like Curt Cignetti. If somebody's going to go to Columbus and win a game this year, I really do feel like Indiana could be that team, especially if Ryan Day can't get the message through to them, like, hey, these guys are not to be messed with. I know that you're going to hear a lot of people going like, they haven't played anybody, and he can be like, look, outside of 2 games this year, we haven't either. We've played 2 better games than them, and that's great. But let's not forget that, we had to have the same attitude against everybody else we've played. So let's make sure that experience in those 2 games is what we learn from, and not the ones that are the same, the same thing. If, that they could easily, honestly, the schedule could fall 2 years from now for Ohio State, the exact way it's fallen for Indiana. And look, so, yeah, outside of the patch, nothing different, right?
If they're looking past Indiana, shame on Ryan Day. Yeah. And again, for real, if you can't get them up with what Indiana's been doing, I get that it's the Hoosiers and historically who they are, but when they walk in undefeated, that's a different beast, and it's time to go prove it and show it. So yeah, I was in the back of my mind at the beginning of the season, and I think you mentioned, being a 5'7" lineman. Me being 5'10", 5'11" defensive lineman, playing all across the line. Let me put my Polk High stats out there, list out there where we're doing it. I think when you look at the schedule, you always think, okay, we'll beat them. This is so-and-so. We should be able to beat them. But now we're at the tail end, and you know who everyone is. And that team that you looked at as an easy W, you already know that it's not going to be as easy, and they're still standing in the way. Yeah, you may not be out of the CFP, but you don't even want to run the risk of anything. And on top of that, you are a team that's been favored to win a national championship, and this is the time where you need to be tuning up and getting ready regardless of who's on the field. But this is actually a really good team that's on the field. So, again, I have Ohio State winning. I think it'll be double digits, but I don't think they're going to bludgeon Indiana, and I think this will be a good stepping stone for Kirk Cignetti and perhaps what this program will do moving forward if they can play them, I won't say to a standstill because I don't think it's going to be within single-digit points, but play them respectfully from where this program is going from in the past to where Kirk Cignetti is taking it, perhaps in the future. Again, we need a few years to see how this really works out for Indiana.
Yeah, no, I think so. All right, Nebraska and Wisconsin play, and it's a 5-6 team versus a 6-5, or whatever, 5-5, 6-4, whatever they are. Nebraska needs to win to get in the bowl game. Wisconsin has cleared that hurdle, but they are so disappointed in their offense that they let Phil Longo go here the last 2 weeks. Nebraska disappointed enough with their offense that Marcus Satterfield gets demoted, longtime Matt Rule compatriot, and Dana Holgorsen comes in, and he is likely the offensive coordinator next year as well, which means a different system than they've been running. He is already calling the plays. He's been there a week in Lincoln. He's going to be living in a hotel unless he gets another head coaching job. But what job's going to be open that Dana's going to want to take? So all that being said, Wisconsin, terrible on offense, even in a near defeat of Oregon last week. Nebraska has just been wildly inconsistent the last month. What are we going to see on the field on Saturday? Because I feel like it's not going to be great football.
It's not going to be pretty football, but I think it's going to fall in a way that Luke Fickell's going to want it to fall. And you mentioned Phil Longo, and we hadn't gotten the results on offense from this quasi air raid mixed with Wisconsin rugged run style that we expected offensively. But one thing with Mike Trussell and what they've done defensively, and I've said that all year here, those young men fly around on the football for Wisconsin. That isn't a Wisconsin style just defense. That defense can travel, and it could play in it's in the Big Boy Conference. I think it could play in the other Big Boy Conference down there where you're at. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to pretty much stifle what's going on offensively in Nebraska, and it'll be kind of a grind out game. But I don't see the offense in Nebraska being able to overwhelm what Wisconsin can do defensively. So for me, it's just like last week. I got to go, with Wisconsin on this one. And still, I don't think it's a terrible thing for what's going on with Matt Rule and Nebraska. It's just it takes steps, and we'll see next year if they take another step. Historically, when you look at his resume, they should. But it's going to you just don't reactivate a sleeping giant like Nebraska. It takes a minute to really get it going. I'll be more interested if there's going to be some changes. I know he's building out through the state, but still sometimes you got to lead a state to do what you got to build in the state, but you're going to have to lead a state if you really want to remain, if you want to get to where the big boys are at right now, when you're talking about Oregon, when you're talking about Ohio State, when you're talking about perhaps next year, it may be like this, but it looks like Michigan isn't going anywhere. Like when you're looking at what Indiana may be able to do perhaps, but in Indiana now is clearly like where we thought Maryland could perhaps be going a couple years ago, or perhaps even this. Indiana is where Penn State is supposed to be. You know what I'm saying? Where it's like, they may be able to beat somebody, and where Penn State now, we know with James Franklin, they're never able to really beat anybody. And again, I have Indiana losing. I don't have them losing in the way that Penn State usually loses when we're talking about top 10 teams. So when you have these teams like here who are selling in the Big Ten, it's not going to be easy for Matt Rule and Nebraska. If this was 3 years ago, Yeah, it would be easier for Matt Rule in Nebraska within the Big Ten. I'm saying not within college football with the schedule, but I got them losing to Wisconsin this weekend, Paul.
Yeah, I do too. Kenneth, always love the segment. This is great every single week. We will talk to you next week, and next week we might have a lot of here we go, buddy, to talk about because it's going to get tense as we get towards the end of these rankings. Kenneth Davis, Big Ten Country, look him up. Also, he does a great podcast on the Bears as well, who are aggravating. I'm not even a Bears fan, and I watch Bears games as a guy who has DJ Moore on my fantasy team going,
oh, don't do that to yourself.
Give him the ball. No, he's on my bench right now. But
okay, yeah.
If you had told me 4 months ago, like, hey, you're going to pick up Quentin Johnston and bench DJ Moore, I'd have been like, no. If DJ Moore tears ACL, no, he's going to be totally fine. He's going to be completely healthy. Yep. Just the offensive coordinator on the line stinks. You won't. Okay, great.
That sounds like Bears football to me. Sounds like you hit it on the head what Bears football basically is yearly here in Chicago. Yeah. So I feel sorry for us, but you guys have a great one. I look forward to talking to you next week, man.
Kenneth Davis, Big Ten Country. Josh Neighbors, College Countdown. He's next. This is 365 Sports.